it.
Are you clicking it?
I clicked it. And we're live. It is Thursday, April 22nd, 5:03 p.m. Eastern Time. And Ben has had a full day of back-to-back-to-back Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I want to raise my voice in objection to this. Yes. I have been on Zoom meetings continuously since 10:30 this morning. Some of them I was on more than one at a time. It's just not good. And when I tweeted my complaints about this, my colleague Nicole Turner-Lee responded, "Please make them stop." Which I thought was exactly the right attitude toward Zoom meetings. Unfortunately, if you put two on your calendar, they will mate, and they will produce little Zoom meeting offsprings.
Wait, what do you mean? Are you serious?
Like rabbit.
They replicate. You think you only have a few, and they fuck like bunnies, and they produce little baby Zoom meetings. And then before you know it, your schedule has just overrun. It's like kudzu.
You've answered my first question, which is whether I'm not allowed to curse on this show. So that's good. That was quick.
Shit, yeah. Particularly when talking about Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
This is my week off. So every month, I schedule a week out of the month where I'm like, I'm not going to schedule my regular one-on-ones with anyone from my team. Like, I just need a week where I can like catch up on writing, and I'll still have to teach and do things like that, but like no meetings. And I still had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22 meetings this week on my week off. What?
Yeah. Yep.
No,
I had 12 meetings. I had 12 meetings over the course of 12 hours last week, twice. So I'm totally with you there. It has to stop. There is something about like the lack of friction and going between places that means that we have like just scheduled things back to back to back, and it's insane. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, especially not on Zoom, which is good because we're on Crowdcast. But we are allowed to have Dr. Professor Elizabeth Bonawitz, who is at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her PhD is in cognitive science, and she works in cognitive development and computational modeling. And she's going to talk about her lab and some of what you research. And I will probably tell the embarrassing story of how Elizabeth and I know each other.
Let's start there.
Yeah.
How do you know each other?
Actually, we just know each other because Elizabeth is married to one of John's teammates from college, from the cross country ski team in college, and so we just all started hanging out way back in the day when everyone was getting like a bunch of John's former teammates. Two of them were getting PhDs at MIT, and Elizabeth was getting her PhD at MIT also at the same time. And we all started hanging out, and I was a number of years younger than all of you and trying to make my way in the world and figure out what to do. And you were all...
You calling me old already?
Yes, I'm already calling you old. Yeah. No, but you were, I was basically like, I'm going to do this thing and go to law school. And then like 10 years later ended up being like, I'm going to do this thing and get a PhD. And it was like, you were already there with me. But anyway, so that's how Elizabeth and I met. And then we had overlap because we had both studied cognitive psychology, or her more than me. And I had a bunch, and she knew a bunch of my professors from Brown. So that is kind of how all of the ways that Elizabeth and I overlap. But welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
I couldn't say no, right?
No, you really couldn't.
That's the slogan of the show, basically. The unofficial, booking slogan of the show is, you can't say no.
Yeah. We try to make it difficult anyway. But so, Elizabeth, give us updates. What is your lab? How is your lab running? What are you working on? Tell us just, I don't know, give us an intro to your work and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, good question. Where am I? So I don't know, you want like a 5-minute version of like what the big problems are in cognitive science and sort of how that all fits in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I'm interested in the fundamental mechanisms of human cognition. And so I think one of the coolest things that makes human intelligence unique, as we're comparing it, say, with AI or other intelligence that's out there, is that we have this incredible capacity to make very rich inferences from very limited data. So we get sparse amount of data, and all of a sudden we've generated all sorts of theories and explanations and beliefs. We have these abstract, coherent, causal stories about how the world works. And it's very, very different from, say, how our current state-of-the-art AI programs are operating, where they have millions, if not billions of training sets, and just to get to the point where if you ask it a common sense question like, I showed up at the ice cream store and I forgot my wallet, what do I do? Its response is something like, buy ice cream anyhow, or ice cream is cold, you should borrow, you should go back home and get your freezer, or like something like that, which doesn't make any sense in the context of like causal reasoning and intuitive, our sort of intuitive common sense. And so the cool thing about humans is we can do this, right? And so children are particularly fascinating because they're the fastest learning machines that we know of in the universe. And so I study them, and I look at their way that children learn about the world, how they form coherent, rich causal theories about all sorts of things.
They don't always get cause and effect right.
The thing about intuitive common sense theories is that they're built on our observations of the world. And so there's all sorts of stuff that we see in the world that conflicts with our intuitive common sense. So actually, there's a great book by this on this. Oh, I have it. I'm going to do a funny thing where I advertise other people's books. I'm attached to my computer. Can I do that? Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yes.
So actually, Andrew Stillman has a great book. Hey, Andrew, shout out to you. Called Science Blind, which makes great points about like why we sometimes get things wrong. But the ways in which we get things wrong are still pretty smart. And the way that kids get things wrong are still pretty smart, the kinds of explanations that kids come up with. So my previous PhD advisor tells a story about how she was on an airplane and the announcement came on to have everybody turn off their phones. Being a child developmental psychologist herself, she turned to her, 4-year-old daughter, 5-year-old daughter and said, "Oh, why do you think they asked us to turn off our phones?" And the daughter said, "That's a good question. I think it's because the airplane is so loud that you wouldn't be able to hear if you had a phone conversation." Right. So she's wrong. That's not why we can't use our phones on airplanes, but it's also right. Like it's a good explanation. Right. So it's true that kids get cause and effect wrong. It's true that people get lots of things wrong about the world because the world, we can't see germs. We can't see the physical properties of gravity and force. We have to infer those things. And sometimes they work in counterintuitive ways. So that's true, but by and large, we get things right a lot. And even really little kids can do things like make inferences about your goals and your intentions and your beliefs from very subtle things that you do. And the science coming out of labs from many of my colleagues shows that even infants can pay attention to very subtle sort of intentions of human nature and make good guesses about like, oh, that must be hard for them. And so that's why they were working, which means they like that, and do all sorts of really rich kinds of common sense intuitive reasonings that are absolutely state of the art top machines aren't anywhere close to being able to do. And so that's the sort of fascination I have with the kinds of problems that I'm interested in solving.
And so how do you address them? What's the mode by which you investigate such questions?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I use a two-pronged approach. The first approach is that I design behavioral experiments where I put kids into a study and I manipulate something and I see how they reason differently or explain something differently or behave differently. And I'll give you a concrete example in a second. And then the second thing that I do is that I form computational models. So I use ideas that are informed from machine learning and AI, where we think about the idea that the world is a generative model that generates the data that we observe. And we specify the learner as having the goal of trying to solve this reverse inference problem. So given the data that I see out in the world, how do I figure out what the actual structure of the world is that produced it? What's the right theory or the right rule to have in mind, given what I can see down here? And that inference problem is you can just solve using something called Bayes' rule. It just allows you to invert that problem. And we can be really specific in our models about the kinds of representations that learners have and how the data should be generated under different kinds of hypotheses. And then we can quantitatively look at the relationship between those kind of learning models and what learners actually do in the situation and see whether or not those models are right, or in what kinds of constraints would the models need to have, like what kinds of beliefs did the learners already have in their head in order to have the data turn out the way it did. So I can give you an example if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Pretty vague. So for example, so in my early thesis work, so I'll pull way back. There'd been work done in the 1970s and 1980s describing and characterizing how children's belief about balance changes over development. So for example, when kids are about 6 or 7, they actually learn a rule for how things balance. And they learn this rule that no matter what, objects balance at its geometric center. So if I had a pen and I was trying to balance it, I'd have to look at where the center was and try to make sure that the pen was sort of right at its geometric center. And that's a pretty good rule. But the problem is if you have, I'm looking at I always have toys. Oh, here we go. Here's a toy. I can make this work. Okay, so the problem is that if you have a lopsided object, right, that has a heavy side and a light side, that rule is incorrect. You actually have to balance it towards its center of mass. And so what we did was we measured children's theories, the kinds of beliefs they had about how blocks worked between the ages of 6 and 8. And we brought them into our lab and we just said, okay, balance blocks like this. And we saw where they tried to balance them. Did they have this wrong geometric rule, or did they always try to balance it over correctly towards where the center of mass might be? And then we'd give kids a problem. So we'd show them a new block that was balancing over here, and we'd show them some other toy that they could play with that might be interesting, but that they've never seen before. So there's one thing you should know about developmental psychology research and research that's existed in human behavior for the last 100 years, which is that novelty is cool. Children and non-human animals love to explore things that they haven't seen before. So the lure of a toy over here is a pretty strong lure. Most kids and non-human animals would want to go explore the new thing. But the trick is that in our study, what we did was we just showed some children a block balancing at its center of mass where it should have balanced. And we showed other children the block balancing at its geometric center. So different children saw different things. But critically, if you're a center theorist, you have this wrong belief about how blocks balance, and you see a block balancing over here by its center of mass, it's surprising. It conflicts with your beliefs. It creates ambiguity in your models of the world. And so even though you have this lure to sort of explain this novel thing over here, if you're sensitive to that, you might continue to persist and explore this block that you've already had some experience with. Whereas if you're a center theorist and you see the block balancing here, which is consistent with what your theory tells you, even though you actually would have never seen a block looking like this balancing in its geometric center, right? That's not so surprising, and maybe you'll show this preference to go play with a novel toy. In contrast, if you're a mass theorist, so you have the right intuition about how blocks should balance, and you see the block balancing over here, well, those mass theorists, that's not so interesting. That's exactly what they predict. Go ahead and play with the novel toy. But if you see the block bouncing over in its geometric center, well, that's weird. That conflicts with your beliefs. And so we just measure what kids do when you see this interaction of where the block's balancing based on what kinds of prior theories they have. And what we found was that the center theorists, that children explored more when the evidence conflicted with their beliefs. And we can understand that in terms of these sort of simple models, these models of ambiguity where your beliefs are weighed by both your expectation and the probability of the data under your current model. And so that's just like one very simple example of how like children's beliefs sort of inform how they explore the world and what they find interesting. During the course of their exploration, children learned and discovered something about the block. So in fact, in all cases, there was actually a magnet that was holding the block in place. And when
you lied to the kids.
That's so fucked up.
All of developmental research is based on magic tricks, essentially. Like, I mean, so what turned out is that the center theorists
permanently screwed some kids up, that they're just like constantly picking up every block for the next 3 years looking for the magnet.
The next generation of Lamarckian geneticists is what they're all going to have in common is they were subjects of your studies.
Please don't call my IRB. I would really appreciate we're having, So, they discover the magnet though, and the center theorists, when it conflicted with their beliefs, they say, why was the block bouncing there? They say, oh, because there's a magnet there. Right. And they could appeal to that. When the magnet wasn't there, when they couldn't explain away the surprising evidence, they revised their beliefs. They learned the right theory. They said, oh, wait, blocks actually need to bounce over towards the heavier side. So that's just like an example of sort of the role of the interaction of prior beliefs and evidence and how that shapes children's play and how that shapes the kinds of explanations they can draw from and the kinds of learning that will result from their own just exploration of the world. So that's like one example of one kind of study. But we also do studies with like EEG, where we're measuring theta. And we do studies with eye tracking, where we can measure where kids are looking. And we have all sorts of behavior.
Tell everyone how you feel about fMRI studies, Liz.
Kate!
What?
What we say behind closed doors is different from what I can say publicly.
So you have the highest regard for high-quality fMRI studies? Is that fair to say?
So behavioral,
you have a palatable thing of this that's like that's comprehensive for the public.
Yeah, no, I mean, many of my friends do very interesting and very good work using behavioral measures, like in conjunction with scanning that helps tell a story. Especially with infants, you can't always get. You want to get as rich a data set as possible, right? They're not going to sit there and explain to you what they're thinking. And frankly, when you ask people to explain what they're thinking, they don't know what they're thinking. They think they know what they're thinking, but come on. So like additional data you can get that starts providing converging measures of, are they surprised here? What's going on? Are they interested? Are they curious? Like you can get brain measures that tell you things like that. There are things that are problematic anytime we're doing sort of localization of something's happening in some area of the brain. There's all sorts of spurious correlations that can happen, but smart people know how to do that right and don't fall into those traps. So
yeah, I wasn't trying to there is a standing kind of tension. So functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is what an fMRI stands for, is basically magnetic resonance imaging are kind of large, cumbersome machines that require you to sit kind of quite still and do other things. In fact, the functional magnetic resonating imaging, fMRIs, kind of track blood movement in your brain as you perform tasks. And so that's why they're functional. You're doing a function and it's tracking your blood movement, or you're feeling a feeling, or they're trying to inspire a feeling in you and they track the blood movement in your brain. And the idea, the promise when fMRIs were originally kind of developed, I would say, in like the mid 90s, was they became kind of really kind of ubiquitous, started to become ubiquitous in like research and new neuroscience research, was that like, wow, this will give us some type of like kind of like we can just like peel back the skull and see straight into the brain and see what's happening. But as we've kind of become more sophisticated about our understanding of this, I would say that like what it basically, as Elizabeth states, like that basically the drawback of fMRIs is that they are just almost like sometimes maligned as like a modern phrenology, that it doesn't tell us anything about kind of the mind just to know, or how the mind works just to know where the blood is going in the brain, or like what any particular type of like thing is happening, process is happening in the brain just by blood flow. And so there's often like the idea that it's like a little bit over determined to do a bunch, to place like a lot of, it once was seen as like, oh, maybe this will be the answer, I guess. And like, is that kind of a good?
Yeah, I mean, it's the game we're playing is a game of constraints, so that, you know, we've got an incredibly complicated problem, which is human intelligence, right? And the system is incredibly complex. And the question is, where do we think we're going to get the most leverage in terms of answering the really hard problems? And to me, the way to start is to actually say, well, what do we think is the problem that the system is solving? Like, let's start with the problem of like what we think the mind is even doing before we start trying to characterize what it looks like. Because if we don't know what it's doing from the top, then what it looks like is not, we don't know what we're looking at in the first place. Right. But these are mutually informative layers that can talk to each other, what we're going to need is a unified story that pulls these pieces together. I should say, I mean, I'm on a project right now where one of the things we're doing, this is in collaboration with Allison Mackey at Penn, who's just phenomenally brilliant developmental psychologist, looking at the role of early poverty and at-risk children in at-risk situations in early development, and looking at differences in sort of cortical like white matter and gray matter tracks, and where those are. And that can actually, you know, we're starting to understand that tells us something about, you know, that relates to things like the development of executive function skills, which is like your ability to like inhibit or plan or think through problems. And so being able to sort of track and understand how these early experiences are leading to brain differences can actually be important as we're trying to understand, you know, health measures and early interventions and what's going on with those things. So I think, you know, you might have gotten a younger version, the Liz version instead of the Elizabeth version, maybe, of the.
Yeah, I know. I was just kind of baiting you. I don't think that, you know, I knew that you had like you developed kind of a, like, you like have a more kind of nuanced version, and you never actually have maligned fMRIs. I was always the one I think I was early in love with them and thought that they had a lot, and then kind of thought about the problem harder and was like, oh, wait a second, and felt kind of duped by the promise of fMRIs. But anyways.
Isn't the fundamental problem, though, that we have this machine, if you want to call the brain a machine?
I do.
We have no general theory about how it works. Because unlike the transistor, we didn't build it. So we're observing its functionality. You can observe its functionality through the behaviors of the individual or collections of individuals, or you can develop tools that shed light on, in real time, on aspects of its functioning. But that doesn't tell you why it's doing the things that it's doing or precisely what it's doing. It just shows you what's active at any given moment of time. And what's fundamentally under theorized is the actual functioning of the machine.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Those of us who do the kind of computational modeling that I do talk about it as reverse engineering the mind. So exactly what you're saying, like there's this machine, it's this black box, and what we have to do is sort of figure out, like, we can give it data, right? We can shoot stuff at it, and we can see the kinds of output we get from that. And we're trying to just figure out what are the structures, what are the representations, and what are the processes that convert what's coming in at it to the behavior that we're seeing. I feel like it's somehow a graphic representation. I like shooting in, splattering out the back. No, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. Just like, you know, in chemistry or other fields where, you know, you can't directly observe the structure of the molecule that you're studying, but you can do, you know, like electron shoot stuff through the crystal and see how it splays out, on this is the thing I had in my mind, which is why I was talking about this, right? How it splays out on the screen behind it. And from that, you just sort of reverse infer, given that I was shooting like this at this angle, what's the structure that it would have had to go through to create this pattern of splats on the back. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the pattern of splats, and we're trying to figure out, what's the machine.
That's a good title for a book.
Pattern of splats.
Pattern of splats. And maybe splat pattern is a good name for a band, too.
Yeah, it's those of us who have had young children in particular, it sort of doubles as experience with just eating with them or anything else.
Yeah. Hello, John Bordeaux.
We have a tremendous number of questions, like an absurd number of questions. And John's was voted up the highest. So I thought I'd bring John on to ask this question. Thank you.
It's great to see you. Thanks for taking the question. And thank you a lot for taking this question, because I've been wanting to ask it for 30 years. So it strikes me that it's possible. I have a thesis here, because my wife is the oldest of four. I'm the youngest of four. And I was curious that perhaps the oldest child has a different cognitive development path, looking up at parents, as contrasted with the younger children, their cognitive development may be affected more by siblings. Am I onto anything here? And can this explain all of our fights?
And can it explain all of what?
All of our fights.
Oh, yeah. I hear
her laughing in the background. And just so that you know, John's wife calls this show Cocktail Hour with Your Imaginary Friends.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to explain why the toilet seat got left up or something along those lines, but I will.
I'm actually good at that, because I had sisters, so I never leave it up.
So here's what I'll say about that, and I'll give you a very unsatisfactory answer. So first of all, we have a very Western way of thinking about family structure and family dynamics, right? So in our weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nation, it's true that many of us have grown up in these nuclear families with our parents and possibly a few other siblings, either older or younger, or twinsies of us, right? Cohorts of us. And it's absolutely true that there's data that suggests that having siblings and being older or younger does lead to different experiences. So in our Western cultures, for example, if you're learning about the world by virtue of watching other people and having people talk to you and tell you things, as well as through your own play and your own interventions, having an older sibling means you're going to learn the kinds of things that the older sibling is learning. And it's a nice Goldilocks kind of situation where they might provide you with sort of evidence that's a little bit challenging for you, right? A new idea or a new concept that you might not quite be able to do, but that you're starting to get ready for. It can sort of bootstrap the learning process in interesting ways. So being a sort of younger child to an older sibling could generate data that's different than if you're the older sibling and don't have someone to sort of look up to or learn from. Siblings absolutely play a role. But in other kinds of communities, right, children are much more are raised in much larger sort of family structures where you've got cousins living near you and close friends, and there's always lots of other kids around. And so there's questions that have to do with sort of our weird society, right? I love the phrase because people think of this Western is centric as the center, but we're actually the most uncommon society that there is. And so it's weird, and use that to sort of frame all their problems and their fights with their family. But I think that there's a little more that goes on there, and there's lots of other experiences, but absolutely it's true. So for example, younger kids who have an older sibling are more likely to develop the ability to reason about other people's goals and beliefs, we call theory of mind, a little bit earlier than kids who don't have that. And I think that just has to do with sort of the evidence of everyday experience, whether they're seeing someone encounter these kinds of situations more often is going to help accelerate that learning.
Awesome. So speaking of play, I have a great question from Paul Wexler. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, this is a great segment. My question is, why are language and play skills so present in children during the early days of their cognitive development? We've been around our granddaughter a lot. She's turning 4, and she's already going past me in some ways. So anyway.
So why are the language skills so present?
I think that, oh no, so it was like, why are language focused and play focused skills so present in children during their like early days of cognitive development? So like, why is that the focus, or has that become the focus of like early cognitive development in children in terms of like how they set up play?
Oh, so you mean from the perspective of the kid or from the perspective of researchers?
I think, well, I think that from what I took from his written question, I took it to be that it was basically a question of like, why, well, I guess from both, but basically like, why has, I guess you'd have to cabin it with kind of a Western kind of valence. So like, given like, you know, how you answered, but like, why are we kind of like at this point, why do we put such an emphasis on the types of play, is play being so necessary to child development?
Yeah,
and if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there is a ton of evidence, and I'm actually not a language researcher, although of course I read some of this literature, but there's a ton of evidence that the way that we talk to children, the amount that we engage with children, but also sort of the quality of the way that we talk to children has a huge impact on their language development. And language development, including sort of, you know, rich discourse skills as well as just vocabulary, are very predictive of lots of other kinds of cognitive feats. So, you know, later success in school and education, math, reasoning, all of these things are linked to early development of language skills. So there's reasons why language researchers really care about that. The reason I care about play, and I actually think, you know, up until somewhat recently, play was often, you know, in conflict in the education literature, where it's like you're either learning or you're playing. School has to decide whether to have playtime or whether to have learning time, and it was this sort of huge conflict in education literature. Roberta Golenkopf and Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and others, Singer, have a beautiful book called Play Equals Learning, from many years ago. But it comes back to this idea that we have theories and intuitive theories about the world, and that children are actually like little scientists. So they're actually performing interventions themselves in the world. When they're playing, they're setting goals for themselves. They're testing out and challenging themselves on new things. They're getting feedback from the proprioception of what they're doing, and feedback from their imagination as they're creating new social situations. And so play is this incredibly rich part of development that is learning.
And how old are children when that is, for that to be true? Because seems to me obviously true when you're watching small children, that this is a huge developmental thing that they do. It's less obvious to me when you watch teenagers play, which really means sitting around talking, and that if you cut out American history class and just let them play, they would get a lot out of that. What's the age range at which the sort of age limit at which play is, becomes what adults think of as recreation rather than this learning, developmentals,
I mean, scientists, I think, until they're 90, think of science as a kind of play, right? Tinkering and experimenting, and makers have the same kind of thread. I mean, sure, when you're joyful and you're enjoying it, like that's...
I do a lot of that stuff, but I also, that's not how I learned algebra, right? And and there is this point at which structured learning diverges a bit from play.
Yeah, so you're tapping into this big question that's a very big field, and about the sort of trade-offs between play versus direct instruction and sort of guided instruction. And there's all sorts of arguments about this. I'm not going to try to recap this with too much detail. But the short report is, and that uninteresting story is that it depends in terms of sort of what's best and why, and for who. So some content you can't learn by playing. I can't learn another language without someone telling me Chien means dog, right? Or something, right? Like you need direct instruction, you need content. But there's sort of more to the story, right? You also need a motivated learner, one who's like engaged with the task, who's sitting and thinking about the possibilities so that it gets encoded, so that they're remembering the content better, so that they are thinking about it later and using it in new kinds of situations. And so, you know, one of the tensions that has existed here is sort of the fact that if you think direct instruction is best, you're just going to study in domains where obviously direct instruction would be best. And if you think play is best, you're just going to do your experiments in domains where, you know, play is going to be best. And something in between, you know, when you need a little bit of structure and guidance. But it depends on sort of the context of the type of knowledge it is that needs to be learned, the current state of beliefs that the person has, and what knowledge they already have in their head. Whether you're asking them to learn something sort of specific and declarative for memory versus understanding an abstract principle that can be applied across multiple domains, like all of these things are going to interact. So you're asking a great question, and I don't have a good fast answer like, oh, it's definitely this, because it totally depends on
the answer is 11 years old. That's when imagination, you know, gets overwhelmed by the desire to be a teenager.
It comes back, I think. There's social play, right? It's actually, Alison Gopnik has a great story about this and work where she shows that different kinds of learning are also younger kids, and I have work on this too, consider lots of crazy ideas. They're more variable in the things that they consider, especially in the domain of physical reasoning. But teenagers, if you try to teach them social rules, actually learn social rules much, much better, have more flexibility than younger children or adults. And so there's different, even like, so teenagers this is the time when I care about being in this, right, hanging out with this person or that person, and I care about the in-groups, right? That's a huge part of that. So your mind sort of is differently flexible depending on your sort of biological maturational needs as well for the domain that you're in.
My favorite of these is the theology of small children, because adults just often assume that children have some theological concept that matches their own. So I'm going to leave names and relationships out of this to spare the embarrassment of the innocent. But a young relative of mine, when she was very, very young, she had a babysitter who was very religious and from a different religion than her own. That is to say, the babysitter was not Jewish and was an evangelical Christian, and used to use words like Lord, God, and Jesus somewhat interchangeably. And my relative developed an entire cosmology of who Lord, God, and Jesus were in interaction with one another, because these things were never explained to her, so she just figured it out. And she figured out a whole theology that has nothing to do with Christianity, but coherently explained the relationship between God, the Lord, and Jesus. And it was perfectly understandable, perfectly rational, and
totally wrong,
utterly unrelated to anything you would think of as Christianity. But when you heard her explain it, who the Lord was, who God was, and who Jesus was, it made a lot of sense, given the information at her disposal.
I love that. I love the way that kids get things wrong. Like one of the ways that the perceptual and since the visual like field gained a lot of like learned a lot was by studying visual illusions. So ways in which, we see something that's not really there, or the perception is wrong in some way. Like that tells us actually a lot about what the system is doing, like the problem it's trying to solve. And similarly, when we study kids, often it's really fun to look at those cases where they get the world wrong and like, well, how did you get there?
But I mean, I feel like this is all of like little kid, like funny thing my kid did, Twitter. Like, I feel like this is entirely the appeal of it, is like, we can kind of see like where they went wrong, but it's funny and creative and like a little bit idiosyncratic, but there's also like a sliver of truth to it, like a lot of good humor. And so it's like a sliver of like kind of comprehensibility. And so it's very funny. But yeah, I think I agree that this is super fascinating. So Richard, so nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see all of you.
So one of so actually Liz is a very talented musician.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, and she sings and does and she can like sing and play piano at the same time, and other and things about much better than that. But that's my primary exposure to it. I know exactly. And Richard is an expert in musicology. But so he has a question about pitch for you. But also your second question is good too, Richard, but I just don't know that she's going to have an answer for that because I don't know if it's her area. So go ahead and throw it out there.
Oh, the music question or
both of them?
Oh, okay. So I've recently read about some studies based on the studies of the singing of some communities who've been isolated from civilization. And one of the things they found was that perfect pitch, that they all seem to have perfect pitch, and that perfect pitch seems to be something that they're speculating that it might be something that is actually unlearned. And so I'm just wondering how much we actually know about the occurrence of perfect pitch in children, and if in fact it does happen, that it's unlearned, and also maybe if it's possible that the loss of perfect pitch could be related to the complex structuring that we find in Western tonal music that gives us a different grid to fit in what we hear melodically.
That's a really interesting question. So a colleague at Harvard of mine in psychology, Sam Mayer, studies sort of music across cultures and developmentally, and I'm sure he would have a brilliant answer for you. What I can tell you is that we do know that there's other domains in which children unlearn things. So Patricia Kuhl is a psychology professor in Washington. And she has found that if you study our ability to hear the differences between different phonemes, so for example, in English, we have R and L, but maybe in Japanese, they don't mark the difference between R and L. They have more of like a kind of W-ish sound. And if you take very young infants that are, 6-7 months old, in US cultures or other cultures with different phonemes, they can hear the differences. They can tell when you switch the phonemes. But by the time those children are raised in their cultures, by the time they're 9 months or 10 months old, American kids can no longer hear the differences that are marked maybe by, I don't know, a French versus I don't know, right? Whereas maybe the children raised in hearing only Japanese can't hear the difference anymore between the R and L. And so it tells us something about how the mind is sort of ready to learn and pruning back, right? In order to have sort of expertise in just the things it needs. And so I love this story about like perfect pitch is something that might get pruned away. I've not heard of that before, but it's super cool. I'll ask Sam about that.
But the other thing is that, I mean, there are many degrees of perfect pitch. And, when we say perfect pitch colloquially, we mean, if you're asked, sing middle C, you can sing something that's within a certain variance of that. But there are really people who can tell A440 from A442, and there's the most perfect pitches are astonishingly accurate, and I find it hard to believe that we're sort of all born with that, and most of us have it stripped away, and a very small number do not. I don't know, maybe that's just wrong, but I do find that hard to imagine.
Yeah, assuming that we have all the hairs as needed in our in our ears, right, cochlear areas. So I'm still shocked that there are people that could hear the difference between a 440 and a 442. But expertise is just something that's really interesting, right? That like as we're experiencing more and more, we really develop sort of richness around that. Like my piano tuner is just like hears things totally differently from me. And, you know, my partner played in a gamelan galactica where the instruments are tuned 20 cents off from each other. And so all I can hear is like a shimmering sound, right? Because the way the sound waves are interacting with each other, it just sounds like it's sort of pulsing as opposed to hearing anything that sounds wrong. So there's all sorts of ways in which it's hard to know what's constrained by our biological system and what's about expertise. But I don't know.
Someone made a funny 2:30 joke in the chat, just calling it out. But Richard, what's your second question?
Oh yeah, so about 12 years ago or so, I actually took an interest in chimpanzees, and so
all of whom have perfect pitch.
I'm sorry, all of whom have, and they do a pretty good job of governing themselves too. So I'm wondering how much we know about the differences in cognitive development between human children and other animals, such as chimpanzees, or what we see, so many of us see day to day, our family dogs. And are these sorts of differences in degree, or are they differences in kind, or are they a little bit of both?
That's a great question. It's a little bit of both. So there's lots of researchers looking at questions like this. It's comparative psychology that allows us to ask exactly like, you know, if we look at, say, a non-human primate that's raised in a human-like setting, right? That's getting all the like social bootstrapping, that's getting all the like pedagogy and all the language. Like they can learn an incredible amount. They can learn an incredible amount of like a lot of like language tones, and they can learn, so they can perform better than their cousins that were raised in the wild in terms of cognitive tasks. But there's also things that they just don't, that they will never actually accomplish that human children seem to be able to do. One of the things that's up for debate that I think is potentially one of these qualitative differences is the fact that there's a great thought experiment by Tomasello and Cal, where they say, imagine you observe the wind blowing the branch of a tree such that a fruit falls to the ground, right? The chimpanzee can learn that there's an association there, that when the wind blows, the fruit will fall. And they can even learn, right, that if their friends climbing up the tree, the fruit might fall. But what the human does that's different is they think about why. Why did the fruit fall? And that allows us to form this causal map of maybe shaking the branch will do it. It allows us to go from association to intervention in ways that are really incredible. And one of the things that humans have beyond that is not just thinking about why in the physical world, but thinking about why of other people. Intentionality and cooperation are two things that we have in our social realm that allow us to learn incredibly quickly, incredibly fast from other people. When you're talking to me, the language is really confusing. There's all sorts of ways that you could interpret it, but pragmatics, your understanding of my goals, my intentions, allows you to quickly infer all sorts of things from that. And this sort of joint attention that children have with their caregivers very early on, these kinds of cooperative learning experiences are sort of related jointly to this problem of like inferring, like that we have a desire to work with other people. We want to learn from other people, and other people have intentions that help us learn. And we're sitting there asking why questions all the time. So I think those are two sort of qualitative differences that we have that other animals don't have, that make a big difference in our ability to ratchet up our intelligence and our cultural and scientific abilities. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I loved that answer. I didn't know all of that. That was fascinating. So we are running out of time, and we have a bunch of questions that we're not going to be able to get to, though you've answered some of them in part. But speaking of association versus intervention, a number of people in the chat are very curious about the your thoughts on basically what kind of long-term effects the pandemic is going to have on children and their cognitive development. That was a question that came up about 3 or 4 times. So I just thought I'd summarize it into one thing and kind of give you a go as to like, I know that this is it's like hard for you to be like the soothsayer on what's going to happen to children because of this massive like global pandemic. But I would be interested to hear if you have any kind of thoughts about it.
Oh God, this is such a complicated situation. First of all, little kids like mine in privileged households are going to be just fine. And I totally recognize the privilege that comes with that because, we could get nannies and extra care. And honestly, they're getting more love and attention from us. They're losing some social time, but those kids are going to be all right. But there are so many kids that have had unprecedented amounts of stress in their lives. So younger children where parents are having lost jobs, there's so much stress in the household. We know stress has huge impacts on development, cognitive development, long-term health. All of those things are real issues.
I mean, massive, like probably one of the most significant, like stress, like just cortisol levels, like basically increasing. And that changes so much about our brain chemistry.
Exactly. And then, the teenagers that have had to go through this, and this is the critical social forming years of their lives. And they've been missing out on seeing each other, and the amount of mental health and depression and things that we're seeing early, everybody experiencing with just not having that social time is huge. And I think that that's going to have real serious long-term impact. So I think as a nation, we're going to need to be investing a lot more science money and time into understanding, long-term stress, chronic stress, and its effects in development and long-term. But I'm saying this from just a position of privilege because there's many of us who, the kids are going to be fine. They missed some school. That doesn't matter. Like we make up random stuff for kids to learn every year. It doesn't matter if they learned that the water table changes across the seasons. Like who cares, right? But they've had social interaction with their parents. Like they're okay, right? But it's the stress and the chronic stress and children losing their parents and losing their grandchildren, massive deaths, right? So all of those things I think are.
I think that there's going to be, if I could predict one thing, just totally fly on the wall from like someone who doesn't really practice or do science anymore in this kind of way, but is familiar enough with it. I would say that like we start to have a broadened definition of what stress is, and post-traumatic stress syndrome, which we have understood as something that you come back from with war or come back from in like these various, very dramatic only have identified only as coming from like very dramatic kind of moments like that we start to have a more complicated and nuanced idea of what stressors are and how stress changes our brain, and that we start to become much more understanding of treating it exactly as you said, Liz. I think, or sorry, Elizabeth. That's like that's exactly right.
Stress.
Yeah.
It'll be good if things that come out of this are more schools recognizing sort of whole child approaches and recognizing the importance of more breaks throughout the day and decreasing homework. I mean, there's so much, I think, that we over school our kids in the wrong ways, but that requires money and support for teachers and we just need to be investing in the science and investing in early child care and investing in mothers and maternity leave to help start offsetting all of these things.
Yeah, totally. So we are gonna leave it there. We tell everyone. Well,
you haven't sung.
Oh yeah. Oh wait, do you want to sing? Or you want to sing for us?
Do you want me to sing for you?
Yes, I do. I just didn't know if you wanted to or not, so I didn't want to put you totally on the spot. But are you really ready?
So I could take the laptop into the other room if you want to hear a funny song.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that. I'm going to turn off your video for a second so you can go into the other room. And I will explain the conceit of what you're about to sing.
Do you know what I'm about to sing?
Oh, I thought you were going to sing Material Girl.
No,
Empirical
I'm
Girl.
not.
You're
No.
not? What are you singing?
No, Madonna. I want to sing AI Lament.
What's
Which
AI
is-
Lament?
Which is
You're gonna find out.
which is like part of your world from A Little Mermaid,
Uh-huh.
except with alternative lyrics.
Okay. But is AI here standing for artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Okay. So the artificial intelligence lament. Not
it's
Madonna.
It's the Madonna music video I'll release next week. That can be our teaser for that. AI Lament is so my friends and I write these alternative satire lyrics, right, to songs that we all know and love. And this one was actually written by my friend Tomer Ullman, so I'm taking credit for his clever brilliance.
Elizabeth, I can't refresh your video. I can't turn you or refresh your screen and come back in because I can't turn your video back on and you're broken.
Oh, I'm broken. Well, let me turn.
You're not a broken human or anything. You're not.
Yes, no, you're a broken human.
I don't know how to refresh video. Let's see if I can do this. Hold on.
Just refresh your browser. You'll have to go back and come back in. She'll come back in a second. John is. Wait, is she gone?
She's gone, and then she'll come back.
Okay.
It's gonna happen.
Hopefully. Waiting for her to reconnect. Is she's back? Yay!
Hi.
Hi. You're still not back with video though. You wanted? I don't know why.
I'm gonna go to options and switch my video.
Okay.
Did
you set up a whole studio for this?
Yeah. Well, no, I needed it so that it wouldn't cut out.
Okay.
Wait, you can see me?
No.
Oh.
No.
You're a green rectangle.
But we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, I don't know how to get the video fixed.
Okay, I'm gonna kick you
options. Out. I know. No, that's not right.
God,
once when I tried to do something live on camera, I shot my computer with a Canon. So
that is so true. I'm gonna invite you back. I've invited her back. She should be seeing this, and she's gonna get brought back in, and now hopefully she'll have video. That's true. You did shoot your. Oh God, I forgot. Like so much has happened in this year.
And here is the computer that was shot with the shattered screen.
Liz, you're still no.
You kind of can't see the screen, the shatter on the screen, but
I don't know.
So lame. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix the video.
Hold on. I'm gonna try one more thing.
Wait, it's because I went from my camera to my here. Settings. I can change my camera. How about that?
Wait. Oh, I think it's working. There it is.
Yeah. Okay, we're ready.
That, guys. All right.
You're good at all the things, Liz.
All right. Can you hear this? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. This is embarrassing.
Yeah, we're really excited.
Here, put her on the full screen so she can be
I am
embarrassing.
I'm doing it.
Oh God.
No, it's wonderful. Yay, Elizabeth. Okay.
Okay. So do you guys know the song "Part of Your World" from The Little Mermaid?
Yes.
I love this. Okay. So this is called ML Lament. So it's like.
Oh, machine learning lament, not AI lament.
Oh, same difference. I don't know.
Okay, whatever.
So you can pretend that it's the AI talking to you. Okay, ready? Hopefully the audio works. Give me like a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Okay.
Yeah, be worried. Look at this net. Isn't it neat? Wouldn't you say that it's Turing complete? Wouldn't you say that this net can learn anything? Look at this graph, tensors
spectacular.
That was unbelievable, Elizabeth. Oh my God.
Wow.
I told you she could sing. I was like, no, she can play the piano and sing really well. And you're like, like, all right, KK. Oh my God, that was amazing. You should have seen the chat. It was going nuts. People are just like, thought that was just incredible.
We will excerpt
I'm like in tears.
We will excerpt it and tweet it out. That was fabulous. Thank you for joining us and for the impromptu performance.
That was just wonderful. Yeah.
Look for the Empirical Girl. The mic is sort of weird. Look for the Empirical Girl song coming out, maybe music video in a week or so.
Excellent. Where will we
Madonna's
find it?
Material Girl. I'll post it on Twitter, and I'll tag the show that you guys inspired me to
I'm so excited, and that was I'm still laughing.
That was very fun.
That was like the lyrics weren't even like a hard fit. They kind of just slide right in there. They're just perfect. It's like really one of those fantastic.
It's all about stanchion. It's all about. So Tomer Ullman got those lyrics down. So you should give him full credit for that.
Totally.
Right.
Well, we are going to wrap, but thank you so much to the multi-talented Elizabeth Bonawitz for coming.
Who is a great American.
I was born in Canada.
Yeah, I know.
Canadians count.
Yes,
it's all one continent.
I'm also American. My parents are American.
Where in Canada were you born?
Ottawa, Ontario.
All right.
Yeah, but I grew up in the States. I'm whatever.
Being contrary.
I'm just being a pain in the ass.
Oh man, this was fantastic. We are going to leave it there. We will be back 22 hours and 54 minutes from now. And I will not be here. It will be a Scott Shapiro and Ben Wittes show. And who is coming on, Ben?
Nicole Pearl Roth is joining us to talk about her new book about cyber weapons. It is going to be the first show primarily hosted by Scott Shapiro. I'm going to be there, running the feeds and interjecting inappropriate things because that's what I do. But it'll basically be Scott's show. And
Scott, by the way, in the small world of things that we would say at cocktail parties, Elizabeth, do you know Scott Shapiro?
I know Nina, who was posing as Scott.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes, Nina Strominger. Yes. So Scott and Josh Knope have an article coming out in Science, actually. Just so.
Nice. Josh I'm collaborating with, so I know Josh.
So you know Josh. I know you know Josh, so that's why I was mentioning that. But anyways, that will all be 22 hours and now 53 minutes from now. And until then, Ben.
We don't have fun anymore. As to the question about Biana Golodriga, she had a sudden scheduling conflict yesterday, which was why she wasn't on when she was supposed to be on. We will get her soon, I promise. We don't have fun anymore, but we do have impromptu musical performances, and we're gonna have more of them. We're having Anna Lapwood next week, who's gonna come on with a pipe organ. So you're gonna have to come and defend your title with Empirical Girl live performance, Elizabeth.
I can't compete with a pipe organ. I don't know how you're gonna get this after that. I don't know.
See you guys later.